street signs. Not saying complete control, but some degree of control, because language is one of the most identifiable markers of cultures. Right? Many, it's not universal, but many cultures, one of the primary things that makes you of that culture is you speak that language. Another is spirituality or religion. Right? If the larger state impinges too much on the national or ethnic groups' ability to practice their traditional religion, that is also going to undermine the individual's ability to see their choices as worthwhile. So there has to be at least some independent control by the group over religious matters. Now again, I'd be willing to say that, okay, some limits are of course okay, right? Traditionally, my Aztec culture, my traditional religion, if you go back far enough, we practiced, human sacrifice. I'm not saying that for the Aztec community to be able to provide individual people a meaningful life, they have to be able to practice human sacrifice. That would be taking this way, way too far. But the basic proponents of it, the traditional, worshiping the traditional gods and those kinds of things, maybe symbolically doing whatever sacrifices might have been seen as necessary, something along those, right? Some degree of control there, again, seems to be necessary because after language, spirituality seems to be one of the next most common things. Like, if you're a member of this culture, you practice this religion. And in fact, some cultures are defined by religion. Jewish culture, the Jewish nation. I'm not talking about the state of Israel. The Jewish nation, as a sort of national group, is typically, not always, but typically seen as centrally built around a kind of cultural identity about a set of religious practices. And actually, for Judaism, it's practices, not actually beliefs. You can be a good Jew and be an atheist, as long as you do the traditional sort of practices. Language, religion. The last one is material culture. Stuff. Now, taking an extreme, this would also include land, which would be very controversial, because cultures overlap too much in the land, right? Because they're always, in the past, and to some extent today, they're always taking over land from each other and stuff. Working that out would be very difficult. But other material culture, bodies, human remains, artwork, ceremonial objects, those things are also one of the major defining characteristics of cultural identity, right? Going back to the Greek case, Greeks have traditionally sort of a few things that sort of that they identify as sort of centrally Greek, historically Greek. Greek language, before there was a Greek state, even if you go back to, say, the Iliad and the Odyssey, there wasn't any Greece then, but there were Achaeans and Minoans and Cretans and this and that and the other, but they were still all Greeks because they all spoke Greek. Right, the language. They all had the same religion. They all shared certain sorts of shrines and so on, religious centers, physical shrines. Athenians often identify themselves by, the height of my culture was building the Acropolis. Right, that's an identifying thing. Now, cultural identity, I do want to mention this very quickly. Cultures are notoriously amorphous. It's very hard to identify a culture, and I don't want to kind of ignore that. In fact, one of the most famous books about cultural identity is called Imagined Communities, where it's very hard to pin down anything specific that all members of a culture have and that no members outside the culture have. It's not the way it works. A lot of these cultural traditions things that are seen as central to the identity of that culture are fairly recently adopted, the last 100, 200 years. A lot of the things that we think of as, and this goes back to, this really goes, no, I'm not actually Aztec, but I really am partly Scottish. And what we tend to think of as Scottish culture with the Highland games and certain sorts of the little knife in the sock under the kilt and those things, those were really only adopted universally in about 200 years ago in an attempt to form a national Scottish identity for independence movements from Britain. But the fact that there's some sort of artificiality or imaginedness of this, right? It's not purely biological. It's not purely territorial. Right? There are people in the German culture all over the freaking world. The fact that it's sort of amorphous this way, hard to define, hard to kind of say, these are clearly people of that culture and these are clearly not, doesn't mean that it's not an important category. It doesn't mean it's not an important concept that makes a difference in the way people think about themselves and their lives and their options. Right? As long as it plays that role of, these are my options, these ways of life are the ones that are open to me. As long as that's the case, I think this reasoning still works, that in the liberal tradition, these three things, language, spirituality, and material culture, have to be given, the cultural groups have to be given a significant amount of control over those things for their members to be able to legitimately be able to say, I can live a good life. So, in cultural groups, I think I'm actually almost, sorry, I'm just keeping my notes straight here. The implications of this, right? We've got the sort of main defense of minority rights now. And my little addition of, look, this idea of, for the cultures to play this role that the liberal tradition seems to need them to play, we have to protect these things, language, spirituality, and material culture. That has implications for the liberal tradition. That is, in a liberal and just society, states ought to be arranged in such a way that cultural communities that do not have minimal sovereignty are catered to in such a way that they can get it. So if they don't have control over their language, if their language is lost, or there aren't any speakers, but there are recordings of them. Native American cultures, by the way, are very good examples for this now, of cultures that do not meet these conditions of minimal sovereignty as minority cultures in a broader state. Right, most Native American groups still exist. There is a sort of a myth that Native Americans are sort of gone extinct. That's not true. There are hundreds of Native American groups still in existence. There are dozens of Native American languages, possibly even hundreds. I'm not as sure of. There are some where the language is very well protected, some where the language is totally gone, no hope of replacing it. No speakers left, no recorded notes of it. But there are some places where researchers have access to recordings and notes about languages, but the actual members of the community don't. I'm arguing that a just society is going to try to make those communities at least minimally sovereign by giving them what they can of these linguistic things. Now, language is one of those things where even if it's in the possession of researchers, you can share it without giving it up. But the same thing happens with spirituality, and particularly material goods, right? Items. And so if you've got a group that doesn't meet this minimal sovereignty, right? If your culture, if your stuff, the artwork your famous artists have produced, the religious items and paraphernalia that are central to your group's religions, if somebody else controls where those things go and what they do, what does that say to you about your culture? Well, that it's a second-class culture, that it matters less, that you're an afterthought. For the members of those cultures to have the self-respect needed to live a good life, their culture needs to have more control over these things. Right? And so, particularly where I'm getting here is that items that can be attributed to a continuously existing ethnic or national group, a cultural community, particularly when that cultural community does not meet the requirements of having minimal sovereignty, those items must be offered back to that community. So that's going to cover a huge range of things in museums and academic institutions right now. Again, particularly for Native American groups. Huge amounts, just about not everything, but probably the majority of the things that we have in museums and so on belong to groups that still exist. I would say belong to them. Begging the question a little less here, they can be traced, most of the stuff in those museums can be traced to a community that has continually existed since their creation. And for Native American groups, you're going to be hard-pressed to give me a case of a Native American group, casinos or not, that meets these conditions of minimal sovereignty that I've just described, particularly in the area of material culture, because most of them have very little control over that stuff. Even with NAGPRA, it's been 20 years since that law was put into effect. And there's still a guy, like I said, there's still a guy at Sac State. It's not just at Sac State, it's all over the place. But I mean, there's still a guy whose main job it is to try to find out who they should be offering this stuff back to. I mean, 20 years later, this is not something that can be fixed like that. Right? So I'm saying we need to try harder. We need to keep finding this. And this would go for any minority. I mean, I'm using Native American groups because they're the ones that we're probably most familiar with. But the same thing would be true for, say, the Hmong people in southern China and northern Southeast Asia. The Hmong don't have a country of their own. They live in area traditionally. I mean, there's a lot of Hmong here in the U.S. There might even be some Hmong in the audience. I don't know. But the Hmong people live in an area that sort of cross borders. They don't live in any particular state. But the states that they do, the states often have collections of goods, a lot of it ceremonial, and have total control over that stuff, whereas the Hmong people, in some sense, have a relatively small degree of control over these things. I think this argument applies there too. China is a multi-ethnic community. It's a multinational state. The nations, the ethnic groups in China that do not meet minimal sovereignty, I think this argument still applies. Of course, China being communist is not going to accept my presupposition of a liberal ideal of a just society. So there's, of course, a huge block in the practical application of the argument I'm making there. But I still think it works. Right? I just want to make clear I'm not just making an argument about Native Americans here. I think any place you find this. Now, I haven't been able to figure this out. I would like to say that this might even apply when a group currently has minimal sovereignty, but the goods were acquired when they didn't. Right? I'm trying to work this argument, so I think my argument does give us a case where, look, if the group currently does not have minimal sovereignty, a just society needs to help them get minimal sovereignty, which includes giving them back some of this cultural property. I think that case I have made fairly well. Whether that we need to give back things that were acquired a long time ago for a group that currently has minimal sovereignty, but didn't when people acquired those things. My intuition is that the argument should still apply, but I don't think I've proven that. If I can figure out a way to make that connection, to say, the reason why I'm worried about it is because, say my group, Greece, the Greek people, have minimal sovereignty now. Because they have a nation. They have a state. They have an actual government recognized on an international level. They have control over their language. They have control over religious matters. There's no outside group enforcing the Greeks to adopt or give up any religious stuff. And they have control over the material goods in the Greek borders, within the Greek borders. They have minimal sovereignty. But if I can make this case that goods that were acquired when the Greeks didn't have minimal sovereignty, such as when they were occupied by the Ottomans,